I'm LaShawn Jefferson, Deputy Director of Perry Woldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's Global Affairs Policy Center. We are delighted to be partnering with UNFCCC, also known as the UN Climate Secretariat, Nairobi Work Group, on this exciting event, and to be joined by Dr. Koko Warner to co-moderate the discussion on the global green recovery opportunity that is before us. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to The World Today, a program of Perry Woldhouse. Today's guests are Professor Richard Fleming and Dr. Musonda Mumba. Billy Fleming is the Wilkes Family Director of the Ian McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology and the Weitzman School of Design, and a Senior Fellow with Data for Progress. In his role at the McHarg Center, he's the co-editor of the forthcoming book, An Adaptation Blueprint, co-editor and co-author of the book and exhibit, Design with Nature Now, and author of the forthcoming Drowning America, The Nature and Politics of Adaptation. He is also the lead author of the recently published and widely acclaimed The 2100 Project, an atlas for the Green New Deal. Prior to joining Penn, Billy worked as a landscape architect, city planner, organizer, and later in the Obama administration's White House Domestic Policy Council. Musonda Mumba is the chief of the Terrestrial Ecosystems Unit. She joined UN Environment in October of 2008 as a program officer in the Climate Change Adaptation Unit based in Nairobi. She was then invited to lead the work on the development of Global Adaptation Network. She eventually led and coordinated the Ecosystems-Based Adaptation Mountain Program, a programmatic alliance with UN Environment, IUCN, and UNDP. She's worked in Peru, Nepal, and Uganda. She has over 20 years experience working at both scientific and political levels on climate change adaptation, conservation, protected areas management, and wetlands ecology. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today at Perry Woldhouse. And the floor is now yours to give us some introductory thoughts about a global green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think we'll start with you, Billy. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for having us. I'm really excited to be able to join Musonda and Koko and you here and everyone else. So I'll be brief. So I think this, thinking about global green recovery, thinking about this moment, which certainly is inclusive of COVID-19, but also of the climate crisis, which is sort of always there lurking in the background, and at least in the American context, sort of renewed focus on, sort of long-standing police violence and state violence that's sort of all coming to a head at the same time, offers us a chance to think about intervening in systems at a scale that isn't usually possible. And that's in large part because, our policy systems are designed to reproduce themselves. And what this moment kind of offers us is a chance, through something like a global green recovery, through a green stimulus, through perhaps something like a Green New Deal, a chance to kind of break that cycle and redesign at a systems level in ways that aren't usually possible. And the way that I typically think about this, partially because I'm trained as a designer and sit in a design school, is thinking about the ability of stimulus funding or recovery funding to lock in lower carbon emissions pathways. So rather than thinking back to, say, the 2009 Obama stimulus, which I was not part of on the passage side, but was part of on the implementation side, was an infrastructure forward plan in many ways that tended to build a lot of things that no one particularly wanted. Built a lot of infrastructure that had been sitting on the books for a long time, unfunded, and locked in a lot of higher emission scenarios for us. So it built a lot of highways and bridges and surface transportation infrastructure. And what this moment offers us is an opportunity to think differently about the kind of infrastructure we build, where we build it, and what the goals of it might be. We get very few moments to think about this kind of massive infusion of capital, which can both lock in a scenario like the one I just described at the sort of low carbon and just future, but can also restructure power on the ground in ways that make these things more durable and more replicable as we go forward. And so if we think about a green recovery or stimulus program as a down payment on something like a Green New Deal, this is something I've written about in other places, specifically in Places Journal, where I wrote about something called Design the Green New Deal, and also in Jacobin magazine, alongside a former student, Zan Lillahai, talking about the opportunity a green stimulus gives us to think differently about the sort of paths that we lock in for ourselves going forward. There are a couple of things there that I just wanted to highlight before I turn it over to Musonda. And I mentioned the Obama stimulus, that this is one sort of important learning moment for us. And this is true kind of around the world, where At the same time, not just in the US, austerity measures were being put in place in response to the Great Recession. At least in the American experience, the ARA, or the stimulus plan, tended to fail or not perform as we might have liked for lots of reasons. The most important are that it was far too small, so less than $1 billion. And there are all kinds of famous reasons for why that was true. It was too tailored towards the business and sort of corporate and Wall Street sectors of the economy, and not towards individuals or sort of everyday people. And sort of most importantly, it was non-recurring. And so in this letter that some colleagues and I put forward probably about 4 months ago now, called a Green Stimulus to Rebuild Our Economy, which has been signed on by thousands of folks. It's now led to sort of what's called a Dear Colleague sign-on letter process in Congress, sort of laid out the various ways in which that stimulus program kind of failed to get us to where we needed to be. And also sort of called for something like a recurring green stimulus as part of our response to this. So if we think about a recovery as more than a one-shot sort of opportunity to restructure power and invest in the built environment, but as something that can lock in other kinds of political processes as we go. And the last thing I'll say here too, before I turn it over to Musonda, is just that, I think if we think about green recovery, green stimulus in the context of something like a Green New Deal, then we have to take the New Deal itself pretty seriously, given it's the central reference. And while there are lots of exciting things about that moment, at least in American history, and there are versions of it kind of all around the world around the same time, then we have to also think seriously about the political coalition that was necessary for it to be possible, which in the US at least included Dixiecrats from the South. And the New Deal, in addition to building trillions of dollars worth of new state and national parks, of all of this incredible sort of natural and built environment infrastructure, also reproduced and extended the life of the Jim Crow South. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on that, but one of our colleagues here at Penn, Brent Siebel, has done some really path-breaking work in the history of the New Deal and liberalism in a book called Shaped by the State, and I think offers some important lessons for us as we think about the ability of a green recovery to both lock in the emission scenarios we want and to restructure power in ways that I think we all want as well. So I will stop talking there, Musonda, and turn it over to you.
That's great, Billy. Thank you. Musonda?
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to really share this platform with Billy, and really honored to have you, Koko and LaShawn, to moderate the session. I just want to start from 2015, because 2015 was a good year. I think the world came together through multilateral processes with the Paris Agreement, thanks to Koko, the team at UNFCCC, Christiana Figueres. I mean, it was a milestone. The Sustainable Development Goals came into effect. It was no longer Millennium Development Goals that were dealing with the Global South, but a global process and mechanism to talk about how can we live sustainably on the planet. And then the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. How do we deal with our disasters around the planet and all of that? If anyone asked me 5 years ago, what would you like to do 5 years ago, in 5 years' time, I would never for the wildest of me thought I'd be living in a world in the middle of a pandemic. But here we are, and happy Chocolate Day, World Day to everybody out there, because chocolates come from the forests. But the very forests that we've destroyed are the ones that are, the animals coming out and the zoonosis that we're seeing, and us having this disease, this very pandemic that has stopped us and our very lifestyles and our tracks, is something to reckon with. And at the same time, in response to your question, LaShawn, I really see this as an opportunity of introspection, because it's a moment of pause. And so as we reflect as humans, I think we've had a moment where we've looked at the skies and they're clear, there are no airplanes, the stories of seeing, the clear waters of Venice or other landscapes, etc. Something is telling us that something went wrong with what we've done to nature. And also our economic systems are problematic, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But one thing that's very clear, it's our relationship as humans, our food systems, our consumption systems, our production systems, our infrastructure, our transport, energy, all of that system thinking that we need to really talk about as we advance this green recovery. And just listening to Billy, it's really wonderful to see how citizenry are now the ones just so desperate for a change and for seeing something more positive going forward. How can we change our ways, and how can this be different? Because yesterday, that wasn't normal. That wasn't good. And clearly, we need to reflect how we're going to thrive and survive in a world that's biodiverse, climate resilient, and we're also pandemic ready, because we were not ready. We were just like caught, deers caught in flashlights and thinking, what's going on? So perhaps I can leave it there. And as we, go ahead and discussing the nitty-gritties and the details, we can talk a lot about that more.
Great, thank you very much, Musonda. And I'm gonna have my kind of wonderful partner in crime and co-moderator and Prairie World House fellow, Koko Warner, start us off with a couple of questions before we move to audience Q&A. Koko? You're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks and good morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's so great to be here with Prairie World House. Billy and Musonda, I was, taking notes in your opening remarks, and both of you mentioned the moments. There are very few moments like this in a person's life, Billy, you said. And Musonda, in your own words, you also very, very aptly said, this is a window, a moment of redefining relationships, all kinds of relationships. To make it a bit more visual in my mind's eye, and for all of our friends and colleagues joining us, could each of you talk to what are the central components of a global green recovery? And what change is required to, bring that vision into life? I'm sure you're wondering which should go first. Maybe Musonda, we start with you, and then Billy.
Sure, thank you. Just at the beginning of March, we saw a picture from NASA, which was quite amazing, seeing the pollution levels across China. And at the same time, borders were locked down, locked down across Africa, locked down across Europe, US, all of that, happening very quickly. So in responding to the issue of components, I think there's a realization now more than ever, the whole visualization of saying we're a global village. If there's a moment where we've become a village, it's now. And also at the same time, the realization that that drop in the greenhouse gases was very telling of the productive systems that we do have. And so then there comes in a rethink. So is there a need to think our production systems and also how we utilize the very thing that's supposed to be staying in the ground, the fossil fuels, in terms of energy, our transportation sector, and all of that. Because for the first time, Mother Earth put us in a sorry corner, and we've been grounded. In responding to the change that's required, I think now for lack of a better term, I think we're at an opportunity where we can create new knowledge and new thinking and new introspection. And also what we're beginning to see, and I think just before we started, we're talking about innovation. Where does the innovation begin? I think we're seeing innovation in the most unusual corners and unusual circles. If we were in the 1900s, it would not have been possible to have this webinar. You'd have to wait for a letter from me, months for that boat to get to you. But here we are in the middle of a pandemic having this conversation and continuing the work that we're supposed to be doing. So we're already beginning to see that this is possible, but how do we transcend that and take it to the next level? And maybe I can ask Billy to take over right now as I think through some of the ideas that we need to be really looking at as we move forward.
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, it was wonderful, and I would just echo sort of everything Musonda just said. But as I think about like the components of what would comprise the kind of concrete policy agenda of a green recovery, obviously that will look very different from country to country, region to region, even within country subregions. But I think there are like a few principles that probably are shared in many, if not most places. And one of those is around kind of maintenance and care, or we might even think of as like stewardship of the assets, the places, the people we already have. And, in the US experience, as we were putting all of this green stimulus work together over the last few months, this was a particular focus point for us in saying that rather than say, taking even the most ambitious kind of Green New Deal proposal that was put out in the last year, which was coming from the Sanders campaign, but there were several others of those during the Democratic primary that were similarly scaled. They still called for building hundreds of billions of dollars in new highways, not just like adding lanes or repairing them, but literally extending highways. And so one of the things we really wanted to sort of put into the conversation was this idea of something like what's called a fix it first mandate. So that all of your infrastructure, all of your housing, all of the components of your built in natural environment have to achieve a certain standard or rating, whatever it might be, before any new sort of funding for those parts of the built in natural environment can go into new projects. So, this is one way of thinking about sort of tackling the sort of fossil fuel complex that is sort of enmeshed with the sprawling of cities and communities that is often, comes after the investment in physical infrastructure that makes it possible. So the maintenance and care principle is one. I think also, one thing that the sort of COVID-19 moment has particularly exposed, at least in the global north, is the fragility of their supply chain and manufacturing capacity. And particularly in the US, a half century or so of outright attack on even thinking about like national industrial policy has left us with, which is not much capacity to think about innovation policy in any kind of strategic way. And so there, in addition to, I think there being real political interest in funneling investment into like formal industrial policy that could stand up different sectors of the economy that could put us on a short path to decarbonization. I think it also offers an opportunity for us to think about, vehicles like ARPA-E in the US, which does sort of long-term, not near-term, sort of like moonshot-related energy research, and whether or not we need other things like it for other sectors of the economy, whether other countries see it as like a similar vehicle or a similar sort of, opportunity to think about ways to lock in the kind of innovation within the public sector that isn't always possible in normal times. And I think, at least in the US, we often forget, or at least I say we, I think the left often forgets that ARPA-E itself was authorized but not funded by the George W. Bush administration, which seems crazy to me now, but it was not funded until the 2009 stimulus. So getting a lot of these kinds of state organs on the books during moments like this, even if they aren't perfect, even if they aren't funded at exactly the level we might want them to, still creates opportunities for us down the line to really think about ways to push some of these issues forward.
Thank you.
We'll definitely kind of move toward, I think, some very important political considerations in this discussion about a global green recovery. Because Billy, you've already suggested that it's going, that the way we understand, you both have suggested that the way we understand ourselves in the world and what will be required of us kind of individually at the societal level and at the governmental level is something, I hate to use the term radically, but it's something perhaps dramatically different than we've already experienced. And to be able to imagine that future and our own participation in it as being different than what we've done now, I think will be obviously required of all of us. But before that, before kind of delving deeper into the political elements of this, I wanted to ask kind of more basic question about the built environment versus the natural environment. And as you look at this potential for a global green recovery, where there might be overlap and complementarity, where there might be a little bit of opposition. I mean, there are certainly lots of people in the environmental movement, not Musonda, of course, who see the built environment as being, the problem. Billy, you put forward lots of solutions that would remedy the built environment as a problem. The built environment is a solution, is a part of a solution. The natural environment and the built environment have to coexist together. But I want each of you to kind of tackle for a couple of minutes where there's complementarity between the built environment and the natural environment, and where there actually might be a little bit of departure and tension that needs to be reconciled, obviously. Billy, why don't you go first?
Well, I really wanted Musonda to go first for that, but I will try. So, I think there are some obvious overlaps, and one is just thinking about, so this is, again, I think where the New Deal analog is interesting, and that it, certainly funnels investment to both of those sort of parts of the world, but I think it views investments in the natural environment as like having biodiversity and environmental goals, but also recreational goals. So thinking about the natural environment, not maybe as first and foremost a kind of consumptive use model, which is pretty common in the global north or in the West, but thinking about it as something that offers multiple benefits and that isn't kind of isolated and cloistered away kind of out there. So I think these old ideas of nature and wilderness as like removed from human interaction are things that like we've largely broken from here. But I think, again, investments in the natural environment offer an opportunity for us to think about pushing that sort of further. And I won't go into a ton of detail, but if you look again at like the natural environment legacy of the New Deal, we get something like 85% of all the state parks ever built in the history of the US. We get something like 45% of all the trees ever planted in the history of the United States. It does all kinds of other things in the built environment, but it also just puts tons of people to work in sort of shaping the natural environment and building up a sort of legacy of recreational and ecological infrastructure that still exists, is still enjoyed by millions of people. And on the built environment side, I mean, also, I think like the more targeted investments are into sort of repair, maintenance, care, retrofit, the less pressure there is to sort of intervene or invade or otherwise develop parts of the country or parts of a country that might for lots of reasons want to remain part of the natural environment. And there's always going to be tension between those things because there are limited resources, there are limited numbers of people who can work on the construction and maintenance of both. But for me anyway, I think thinking about those as like part of a continuum of investment is hugely important. And thinking about them as like related both in their sort of ecological processes and like the way that people sort of move between both of them throughout their daily lives.
Great, thank you. Musonda, could we hear from you on your kind of analysis of how the built environment and the natural environment need to work together in this global green recovery, and where you see kind of opportunity versus maybe a little bit of opposition?
Absolutely. I mean, I live in Nairobi, Kenya, and Nairobi as a city has two things that are so precious to the world. First of all, it's this one city in the world that has a national park. I was looking at lions just last week, Tuesday, with my children, smack in the middle of a city. And you can see my picture on Twitter. You can see a skyline, and then there's a lion lying there. And it also is home to Karura Forest, which is the one forest that Wangari Maathai, Professor Wangari Maathai, the first female African woman Nobel Peace Prize winner, the late Maathai, who secured this one space of forest land smack in the middle of a city that everybody in this COVID pandemic time in Nairobi goes to for recreation, to walk, to just recover and really reconnect with nature. So here I am in an African city and in a forest system that's the second largest in the world in the city. And really telling to the fact that even when you read about Wangari Maathai and what she went through, being thrown in jail, fighting for this space and the conflicts, the policy conflict that was ensuing, and how she stood and said, we need the city for cooling of the city when it hits up. By then, all these extreme weather events were not quite happening. But here we are in this climate change dynamic where extreme weather events really have manifested smack in the city, and the built environment, concrete mostly, hits up very quickly, and you can feel when you're on the other side of Nairobi that it gets much warmer. So in speaking to what Billy was saying, I think what we need is also sort of this policy shift for people. I think what citizenry are also doing is to demonstrate and share, look, this works for us. We need this green space, and how do we go about deciding and picking those green spaces? But what we've seen also here in Kenya and many parts of the world is where, infrastructure like roads, there is the train system that's gone smack through Nairobi National Park. It was heavily contentious, but citizenry tried to really be the ones that talked about and say, no, we don't need that. And I think there's a realization now more than ever that the planning can be done differently. It's funny because I was looking at a picture, several pictures that friends of mine sent from Rome, and looking at Rome totally empty. And someone saying, for the first time, they've seen Rome empty, and they can visualize a city that can have things growing vertically in specific spaces. And I think this is also a moment for planners to suddenly look into the cities and look at them differently with different eyes and what they can offer, because we are very much aware that by 2030, more than half of the world's population will be living in cities. What does that mean? And how do we rethink our lives in cities? And I think that's important for energy, for water production, for heating, and all of that. And this is the moment where we begin to rethink all of that, because we just have this window.
Great. We'll maybe have another question from Koko. So question and a half. There may be another one from me, and then we'll move to the audience Q&A. So Koko.
Yeah, thank you so much, Billy and Musonda. This, in your remarks up until now, I've picked up two words that both of you have mentioned. And again, Musonda, in slightly different words, but Billy, you mentioned stewardship. And you also mentioned innovation. And that those are fresh to me. Those aren't necessarily things that I've been hearing in the green recovery conversation. And Musonda, of course, you had mentioned kind of rethinking our relationship to each other, to our built environment, to our political systems, and of course to nature. And that feels fresh and good and new. So Billy, this question goes to you. You know, people are worried. They've got a lot going on. As you said, right as you got out of the gate, we've got a pandemic in many countries of the world. And of course, in the United States, we've got all kinds of racial tension, social tension. The economic fallout of the pandemic on top of great inequality has a lot of people very burdened and very worried. Billy, why should people care about a green recovery? And yeah, maybe you can talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think one of the things I typically kind of end up at when I think about this question is just the realization that we don't really have a lot of other options. There is no like pre-pandemic world to bounce back to. That world is gone. There is no reconstructing it, and so the choice before us now is like, what kind of future do we want to build? And there are certainly like lots of competing visions for what that would be. I think broadly, the sort of contours of a green recovery offer us the most hope for, what a future might look like for this planet. And not in a sort of utopian way, in ways that are kind of naive or romantic, but in like a realistic way about a world that is just frankly like less bad, which is probably about as good as we're going to get now. And I think, again, like there are lots of different ways to think about this. And I think it's easy sometimes to think about technologizing our way out of this problem, but this is much harder than that. We aren't going to like, wind farm, solar farm, advanced nuclear plant our way out of this. There are lots of harder choices to make. And frankly, the idea of investing in people and places that already exist is a harder political sell in many places than investing in sort of infrastructure that's out there and technology that is out there, in sort of really entrenched political interests and power that is also sort of constantly behind the scenes trying to undermine a lot of these ideas as we push them. So yeah, I think about it as kind of, again, a choice about the kind of future we want. And until I hear of a better one than the one that green recovery principles offer us, that's where I kind of sit.
We'll move in a minute. Maybe give me one quick question that's in part taking from what's in the Q&A function. I mean, you both talked about, Billy, you ended your comments with a comment about political entrenchment. And it does strike me and many people in the audience that this requires a kind of, some might argue there's a trade-off situation. And let's take the first question first, which is that, is a global green recovery consistent with continued economic growth and development? I know the answer to this. I think everyone on the call knows the answer to this. And yet I think it's a serious consideration because in many countries, green recovery has been analogized to a slowdown for everyone and a perhaps worse living environment for some people. So I wanted each of you to talk about, if not a trade-offs question, whether or not we can expect continued economic growth and well-being along with a global green recovery. And Musonda, why don't we start with you and then we'll move to Billy.
Thank you so much, LaShawn. I think the reality is, it's best not to put, the world in this one blanket box. But the reality is that the pandemic has hit the globe collectively, but also a realization that our economic models as we've had them have not worked. So something is broken. And similarly, our food systems have been problematic, which is why people are getting sicker. Our pollution, the pollution elements in terms of the infrastructure we have, and similarly the cities that we live in, something is not quite right. So how do we then, it's back to the conversation we were having around even just having green spaces in cities, changing the technological, and Billy's right, we cannot just technologically walk out of this, walk into this new world and say we're going to resolve it with technology. No. And I think this is where issues of agroecology come in, rethinking our food systems. The very fact that, just talking to the US, for example, the levels of pollution in the food system, that's not very good for people and not healthy. So how do we rethink those food systems? The power of family farming. We're in the UN decade of family farms right now. How do we encourage those family farms so that there's also continuity, and people have jobs and they're producing food that is really in season and all of that. And similarly, when we talk about the transportation sector, for example, I think there's now, we've been tinkering on the edges for a long time. How do we rethink the technology around transportation? The very buses that navigate our cities, the very cars we use, and even the very airplanes that we're going to be going back to in a few months, and people are already going back to. How do we rethink all of that? So, and really speaking as somebody who's coming from the UN Environment Agency that speaks to nature, how do we restore the very degraded spaces that we've destroyed? And now we do have the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which kicks in in 2021. And that decade came under effect through a multilateral process on the 1st of March 2019 through the United Nations General Assembly. And that is amazing. So the power of multilateralism, how do we come together to find really solutions, a mix of solutions that work for everyone, and obviously these solutions will be very specific to specific localities and context specific as well.
Billy, do you want to answer as well in terms of whether or not we can have continued economic growth and an improvement overall in life? I think, like I said, I think we all know the answer to this, and yet I think it's worth demystifying, not that this won't be hard, but that it's doable and worthwhile.
Sure, and I'll be quick. I know we have other questions we want to get into, but I think this is where, one of the things that I appreciate about Musonda's remarks, and one of the things that's most exciting about the work we get to do in the McHarg Center, is that almost all of our research, all of our projects begin with like the same question, which is how useful or not is what we're doing to the movements that we are trying to like serve with the work that we do. And oftentimes it means going directly to movement leaders and asking them sort of what their visions for the future and something like the green recovery would look like. And at least in the US experience, like those visions are like very radical and clear and not about the kind of austere or degrowth kind of principles that maybe sometimes creep into our minds around a green recovery, in part because I think we're used to imagery of, offline airports, of shuttered cities, and, for folks who watch a lot of right-wing media, of like a future without cows, which is like the world of a Green New Deal that folks like Sean Hannity like to imagine for us. But one of the things that, say like public housing residents through groups like People's Action in the US have put on the table for us is this idea of sort of public luxury and private simplicity. And it's not a new idea, but it's one that they sort of put back into the conversation of sort of grand social and public housing, of beautiful and efficient transportation systems, and of verdant and accessible parks and open space in every community. And this has nothing to do with like shutting down the economy, which I think is not at all what we're talking about. We're talking about a more managed economy where, this sort of mythical, or this myth of like a market being able to solve lots of these problems that it itself has created for us sort of recedes into the background. And we think about a more forceful role for the state, for the public sector, for government, and through those for people in shaping their future. Not in ways, again, that are about austerity, but that are about splendor and sort of public luxury.
Koko, I'll insert one more question and then I'll turn it over to you. So we've got lots of questions now in the Q&A that cover kind of lots of issues, but one of them that seems to be recurring is, I think there's a penchant for people to not want a silver bullet, but want to know, in the vast array of possibilities in the world that will contribute to global green recovery, are there 2 or 3 priorities? And I want each of you to think about this for a second. Is that realistic? I don't know, but that's the question. Are there 2 or 3 priorities that you would say warrant organization at the global level? And what does that multilateral cooperation look like, generally speaking? So first of all, are there 1 or 2 priorities? And then at the global level and multinational level, where would you stake a claim? Where are you the most hopeful in what you see by way of a way forward? And obviously implicates Koko's home base as the secretariat, but whichever of you wants to go first with that can.
I could start. I think yesterday was World Zoonosis Day. I don't know if people are aware of that, but it was. And so,
but Musonda, tell people what that was then, since I'm guessing that not everyone who's tuned in knows that was being recognized.
Okay, so the reason we were celebrating, or at least recognizing, perhaps that's the right word, recognizing World Zoonosis Day is because zoonosis is the actual movement of a disease from an animal to humans. And this is what's happened with this particular virus, the coronavirus. And so how do we reduce zoonosis? We have to reduce zoonosis by obviously managing, the farming, mechanisms that we have, because we're finding several viruses in farm animals, and similarly managing the very ecosystem's nature. And I think that's one point I really want to put centrally. And we released a report from UN Environment yesterday that was released by our executive director, Inge Anderson, that really talked about, let's stop just dealing with the symptoms of the issue. The reason we have the virus and the pandemic right now is because we haven't dealt with the issues of natural destruction. And now it's come closer to us than we had anticipated. So the natural element is very necessary to this new, the global Green Deal, or whatever we may want to call it, but across the blanket, how we deal with nature is very, very important. Then secondly, the element of energy. I think, for the longest globally everywhere, the issue of, fossil fuel utilization, et cetera, I think we're beginning to see now a shift in the costs of renewable energies. And so how do we have a conversation around that? And I think there's a worry, especially when we listen to African countries, we need to do something because people have lost jobs, and what can we do? And I think this is the moment to rethink, okay, can we even rethink some of these jobs? What does that actually mean in reality? So when we speak to energy, we're talking even in the transportation sector, already we're seeing innovations around having transportation with cleaner, cleaner technologies and energy, and some of them that are even, have solar panels on them. Like, this is amazing. Wow. Okay, we could do this, but we didn't do it a few years ago. And then back to your question on multilateralism, I think the UN is going to be turning 75 this year. The last time the UN was formed was in the middle of a war, and it was formed to bring together nations to really think, how do we go ahead and be at peace? So how do we go ahead in 2020 and be at peace and have a less, be susceptible to these pandemics, and also in a climate resilient world? Well, we need to reduce our greenhouse gases. Our lifestyles matter, how we trade. And I talked about sustainable production and consumption, our very lifestyles. I was shocked to see a picture of people the moment the British lockdown was just pulled out, people lining up from 4:30 in the morning to go and buy clothes that they're going to be getting rid of in 4 months because it will be winter. What is that? What is, what happened to the old summer clothes? What was wrong with that? So these questions, we need to be asking these very dramatic personal questions, because ultimately the change starts with me at my personal level, what I'm changing in my being. So all of these are very, very critical as we move forward.
Billy?
So I will be quick because I think Musonda covered that very, very well. The sort of two principles I think of are around jobs and work, and around kind of technology transfer. Or you could think of it as industrial policy broadly. And on the jobs and work piece, like in the US, we're on a path towards sort of Great Depression level unemployment, if not already there, and we just maybe don't quite know it yet. And so we're talking about a quarter or more of the sort of workforce being jobless, and most of those jobs not coming back whenever the economy is sort of back at whatever state we consider like better. And I'm thinking in particular of, say, like the service industry, where, certainly restaurants, but also retail operations just are not going to be able to weather this without sustained and sort of much more generous forms of stimulus, which seem unlikely in our particular political context, at least in the short term. And so thinking about something like a jobs guarantee, which, we've had versions of in the past, we have kind of versions of now in soft ways that are targeted towards these aims of decarbonization and justice. So we have a quarter of the country out of work, and most of those jobs are not coming back. Why not also think about ways to put them to work, weatherizing our existing buildings to get them to lower no carbon standards, to repairing and upgrading all of our infrastructure to get them to an A or B plus or whatever rating from the ASCE, and sort of on down the line through our sort of natural and built environment. And then thinking about, the industrial policy side of this too. One of my friends who is Kate Aronoff, who writes for the New Republic, had one of the sort of few, but I think quite incisive, critical sort of analyses of their recently released sort of Democratic climate plan in the last couple of weeks. And the headline is something like, the Democrats' new climate plan is weirdly isolationist or imperialist. And for very good reasons. One of those is that it makes it very, very hard and expensive for nations in the global south, many of whom we actually get most of the resources to build our sort of solar panels and wind turbines from. It's very, very hard for us to transfer technology to them at any kind of reasonable cost. And so I think thinking about, the US's sort of responsibility to something like a global green recovery is particularly important, given that we are the largest sort of over time contributor to emissions in the atmosphere, and thinking about, not just setting ourselves on a rapid path to decarbonization through something like a green recovery, but making it easier and cheaper and faster for other countries to do the same by giving away some of the things that this sort of bolstered public venture capital industrial policy system could create.
Billy, you mentioned this, and then we really are going to turn to Koko, but since you mentioned it, I think that it's important to return to it, which is that, can this global green recovery happen without the US? You've envisioned and you've written about a kind of green foreign policy. I think there are many of us who would love to see that happen. It would be difficult for it to happen given that the US is not leading in any meaningful way. But I'm curious about both your assessments of whether what you're talking about and envisioning can happen absent the US, and if absent the US, who's leading, and how can you have the US advocating for kind of a green global recovery when it's doing such a poor job at home? Musonda, do you want to go first? Yep, you're muted.
I'm pointing at Billy to go first because he's
okay, Billy, fair enough.
It's a great question, and I think it's almost like an impossible one in some sense, because the U.S. has, the U.S. sort of model of engaging with the global community around climate is typically to make global agreements as watered down as possible, and then to back away from signing them once they have watered them down, which we've done over time. I think we've seen happen with Paris again, and it's not the fault of the folks in the room at the time those agreements are negotiated, because many of them are swept out of power after those agreements are made. But this is the trend in the US, I think, when thinking about global climate action of any kind. And so I think whether or not it's realistic in the short term to expect, a country that has retreated from any kind of possible modicum of leadership in the global community to take this on earnestly, is the answer to that is probably no. But I think we have to think longer term than the next few months and maybe even the next few years. And ultimately, again, I think like the U.S. has a responsibility both because of its legacy of emissions contributions, and also because of its legacy, I think, of sort of muddling the sort of the global climate action community through some of its actions to think about ways that it could, again, I think, lead again on some of these issues. And some of that will be material or financial, some of that will be technology transfer related, and some of that will just be, I think, thinking about the most sort of rapid or efficacious way to decarbonize our highest emission sectors first. And in the US, that's typically going to be, transportation, buildings, and electricity, for most of which the technology already exists to sort of either get us all the way or most of the way to net zero.
Musonda, in terms of who's leading, since it's obviously not the US, and who you need to lead in order to have a meaningful global green recovery? Or which groups of countries or regions?
That's a very interesting question. What I can say is that nature loves a gap, that's for sure. So when there's a gap, somebody takes in some level of leadership, and I think we did see that during the World Economic Forum, different conversations around who's taking a leadership. But I was also wonderfully surprised with President Trump supporting the Trillion Tree campaign, which we've been involved in and supporting around sort of the restoration agenda. But in speaking to leadership, I think one thing that is so fundamental and so important in terms of who do we see as leaders, for me, I think we also have to go beyond even just elected leaders. The fact that young people, the Gretas of this world, other young people have emerged, that is leadership. They're really raising the voice to say, no, you're not leaving us this problematic planet, do something about it. And we're going to be doing something about it as young people. And also what I began to see and just really realizing the role of different states within in California, for example, just saying, well, this is what we're going to do around sort of the green recovery and committing to that. For me, it's been amazing, that level of leadership. But at the same time, I think what we're beginning to see, even across the, the African continent through the climate change negotiations, for example, is African countries also beginning to say, okay, so we are not decarbonizing. We're the ones that need low carbon technologies, and we cannot go that way, because that way, not good. So how do we improve skill sets for youth? We are the largest market block as a continent. Our voice matters. I mean, Africa's voice matters. So that's really, really important. So, and I think an opportunity to provide leadership. There's also a lot of reflection from China. I think China has gone full on. They were going to be hosting Kunming conference on the post-2020 biodiversity framework for the conventional biological diversity. They're restoring huge amounts of land and also having landscapepreneurship jobs for their constituencies. So we're beginning to see levels of leadership shown in areas and corners that we hardly anticipated. And I think this is a moment where, this pandemic is really beginning to tell us that maybe the suddenly unusual suspects they're coming to the table.
Koko, over to you.
Oh, thank you. And I'd love to pick up on that. I've just been monitoring the active and terrific questions that our participants have for you. And because of time, I'm lumping a lot of these excellent questions together. But Musonda, you ended just now with this overarching idea that nature loves a gap. And leadership, positive leadership, constructive leadership is popping up in many places that maybe are a bit surprising and unanticipated. So let me kind of create a question conglomerate for both you, Musonda, and Billy. Many of our participants wanted to know about political alliances. A couple of our participants heard you, Billy, talk about earlier when the New Deal was created, that it really took a political alliance, and some of us maybe didn't know that. And there are both some positive as well as potentially not so nice social consequences of those alliances. So I guess what I'm asking for both of you is, could you talk to the architecture of a political alliance, either domestically or even regionally or internationally, that would help bring a green recovery, a Green Deal into reality? What would it take? Certainly there are detractors. There are many right now who say, Billy, you talked to this, it's like, we have enough on our plate. Let's not go try and do new things. And so what's the architecture of the political alliances that we would need now to bring us into a safe and good and well future? Thanks.
I think I'll try to go first. It's also like a very hard question. So I might just point back again first to the New Deal and think about like what was required for that to be possible. And they had their own set of overlapping crises. It's the Great Depression, and a third or so, almost a third of the country out of work. There's the sort of rise of global fascism, sort of certainly in Europe, but also around the world. And then there's also the sort of environmental crisis at that time, which in the US is the Dust Bowl, and 3.5 million or so Midwesterners being displaced and relocated as their sort of agricultural fields literally sort of disappeared into the air. And FDR, I think recognized that crises allow for extraordinary things to happen, and actually begged his predecessor to not act after he was elected so that things could get worse. And when he came into office, he would have sort of more runway to do more things. And I think that's an open question about how bad you actually let things get before you try to put the most ambitious idea sort of through the organs of the state as you can. But I think that particular move for him opened up more possibilities. And then the other thing that I think, was particularly powerful in building a durable enough coalition for the New Deal to be experienced over the span of, say, 10 years, as opposed to like a one-shot deal that we saw in 2009 with ARA, is that he funneled most of the first wave of investments into the places that hated him the most. And so it wasn't necessarily that, FDR was elected by, a mostly northeastern and urban constituency, and that's where he funneled all of his sort of first wave of investments. He actually sent them to a lot of the places in the country that did not vote for him. Now, there were lots of reasons to do that, partially because that's where some of the highest needs were. And if you think about the sort of frontline communities, sort of plank of the Green New Deal or Green Recovery, the same would be true today. Here in Center City, Philadelphia, not that we're without like any needs, but relative to where I grew up in, say, rural Arkansas, there's a lot more need for sort of state-led investment in places like that than there are here in Philly. And so I think thinking about that kind of political strategy is hugely important. And then again, to come back, and I'll stop talking and let Musonda jump in just a second. But the other thing I would say too is that, you know, when we think about like multilateral cooperation, ultimately, you know, the U.S., people imagine the electricity sector as like the first domino in a path towards global decarbonization. And whether that's true or not, it's certainly one of the first dominoes. But that isn't possible without the literal resources of other countries, many of whom this country has a very long history of treating very, very badly. And so thinking about this as an excuse to better those relationships, to make them more equal, to make them more just, and set us on a path to like rapid decarbonization, not just here, but in other places, it is how I tend to think about, you know, the question you just posed, Koko.
Thank you, Billy. I mean, it is a complex question, but I think, you know, the reason I was looking at the Sustainable Development Goals on my wall, because I think for me, the SDGs are what really have united the world into thinking, how do we live sustainably? And if there's any moment in our history when we can rethink that sustainability, and one of the goals, goal number 17 talks about partnerships and what does that actually really look like. And there's a book that I really like and I've read entitled From Summits to Solutions, which was really analyzing all these different elements of the Sustainable Development Goals. But one particular chapter came to me around partnerships. How do we, and your question to that question, Koko, these political alliances, what do these alliances look like, and what does that actually mean? I think what brings people together is an issue of change. When change happens, we are in a really fundamental shift in the history of our humanity. So in that change, people begin to sort of figure out what kind of alliance should I be forging and which direction do I want to go. And so what we're seeing here, I mean, just going even what the political relationships and partnerships look like, it's how do countries engage not just at the political level, like here in the African continent, you've got regional economic bodies, or what you see as the EU bloc, for example, what does that actually mean? And similarly, the role of private sector entities, philanthropies, individuals, indigenous peoples, these voices that matter. How do we build alliances around these particular elements? And I think, how do those pieces of the puzzle come together? Because ultimately, what we need right now and what we want, even as we're going towards a green new recovery, is a new societal approach. Yesterday's approach didn't work. So if that societal approach didn't work, what do we need to change? And that changing requires partnerships. And so then it begins to ask the question of, okay, how are we going to do it? Who are we going to do it with? And what do we need to do together collectively to have a solution? And I think that's where the moment happens. So in measuring that outcome that we want to see, what is the outcome that we want to see? Do we want to see, you know, more jobs, but are they greener jobs? Or do we want to see better food system? Is it more nutritious food? And just really echoing the voice of David Nabarro, who's a special envoy for COVID, he said, no, let's stop using post-COVID. We will continue living in a COVID world for the foreseeable future. So what does that actually mean? How do we live and navigate in this COVID world? And I think if there's a moment for partnership, it's now. And it's for us to define what that means for a bloc like the European Union in partnership with Africa, similarly with Asia, because back again to my point earlier, we're in a global village.
I mean, we very, very regrettably only have 3 minutes left and a raft of questions. So it'll be hard to narrow them down quickly. Koko's going to get a final question. I'm going to get a final question. We're going to close out. But I want to ask, based on what you've just said, if you could each respond briefly to the moment. So on one hand, you have this moment where we've seen people hunkering down, using less, improvements in the environment, but you've also had like an increase in single-use plastics and the use of disposable things, at least in the global north. And yet there's this opportunity to reconsider how we are living our lives. So what's the public narrative message that you need to convey to people that it's worth their while? Like now, there is no better time than now, that we've all been hunkered down for 4 months, and to reconsider this vastly different future of a world that is sustainable for everyone. So I'm not talking about the message for the politicians. I'm saying, what is the message for the everyday citizen that would compel them to make the type of changes and advocate for the type of structural changes that you two are suggesting? Very briefly at 10:58, and then Koko will get a question, and then we'll close out. Who'd like to go first?
I'm going to go first. I mean, the very fact that Rwanda, over 10 years ago, banned plastics, that was almost unheard of. People were like, oh, but you know, my shoe bag is plastic and I'm going to travel to Rwanda. What am I going to do? The fact that a woman who's cleaning the hotel could come up to you boldly and say, you better take that back with you wherever you came with that from. That was incredible for me. And then the wave continued, and we saw Kenya get on board as well. Kenya has just banned single-use plastic. And then as we were navigating the whole multilateral space here at UN Environment, we had the UN Environment Assembly that was talking about circularity, issue of circularity. And the EU came over and, came to the table and said, well, we need to ban single-use plastic. It's not just good for the planet. So we're beginning to see that, lessons don't just, converge from the global north to the global south. Even the global south has so much to teach the global north. And also, I think there's a moment and a window and opportunity where we're learning from each other. And I think every individual has a role to play in that. My children, and when I go to a restaurant, no matter where we are, somebody offers them a plastic straw. No, we don't do that. We don't. The fact that my children know that we don't touch plastic straws, automatically I'm raising these individuals that should be aware of what they should be using. And I think, lastly but not the least, there's a book that's been written by a lovely woman called Tara. I shall remember her last name. And she's talking about, reducing plastic in everyday use one day at a time, coffee cups, this and this, things that we can do, our toothbrushes, everything. And it's amazing. It's just amazing. And it's doable.
And Billy, you probably have an answer to this, but in the interest of time and giving Koko a moment to ask a question and then closing out, I will turn the floor over to her.
Oh, thank you. This has been such a fantastic conversation. I'd love to spend all day with all of you just listening. So actually, rather than a question, I just wanted to say thank you so much. And perhaps if Billy and Musonda, you had one or two last thoughts that maybe you didn't say that you think you'd like to send us off with this morning or this evening. And again, just wonderful collaboration. UNFCCC has just appreciated this. Thanks for the great partnership.
Thanks so much for having us. Yeah, I'll jump in and then I'll let Musonda take us home. So I'll partially respond to LaShawn's great question in closing this. It just, I think the way that I think about this is that the system is working exactly as it's supposed to. And when I think about like how I have conversations with like family and friends about what comes next, that's often where I start, because this isn't a failure of, it is in some ways a failure of leadership and a failure of markets, but those are also designed to fail in just exactly this way. And so as we think about the world we want to build next, and that there are obviously many steps between like that and talking about the managed decline or, sort of shuttering of, say, the fossil fuel industry or other big contributors to this particular, to our particular sort of global crises. I think, most people want to see their family again, want to see their friends again. I'd love to also see my students again and all of you again in person. And that can't happen until we think about ways to design a different system.
No, thank you so much for really having us. I'm just so excited. The book is written by Tara Shine, and it's entitled How to Save Your Planet One Object at a Time. And it's just fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. I just want to say and really echo Billy's points that I really would love to see my family, my loved ones, connect with colleagues, have those coffee moments where we're having, Koko, you and I, just really reflecting and having deep introspection and really looking forward to how, and potentially meeting you, LaShawn, in person. And just what amazing minds and what amazing work is being done in many corners of the planet. And I just want to say that I think youth voices and women voices have been incredibly powerful in making sure that they challenge the status quo and say that we cannot be living the way we lived yesterday. That yesterday is gone. And this moment that we have now is just this window that we need to change the way we live, the way we build, the way we buy resources and all of that. And I just want to thank the Perry World House team in the back end, just doing such amazing work and making this very possible. And to the amazing audience that joined in, thank you so much. And your amazing questions. We'll try and figure out a way to answer them.
Yes.
Hopefully.
Well, and thank you to the both of you. It's been another exciting edition of The World Today. Thank you to Koko for absolutely seamless and thoughtful and intelligent co-moderation. I want to invite the audience that is still online to join us, in fact, on Thursday for the next edition of The World Today, Bounties, Briefings, and Bromance, the state of U.S.-Russia relations. That's at 2 p.m. Please RSVP online. Billy and Musonda, it's been an extraordinarily rich conversation. You've given us so much to chew on, to think about, and ways to be better individually and collectively. We look forward to a continued conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.